Chapter 1. The Vicarage Garden Party. It was a golden June afternoon in the village of Alcombe, the kind that seemed to promise nothing more than cordial smiles, sponge cakes, and the occasional wasp. The vicarage garden was in full bloom, roses cascading over trellises, foxgloves standing tall like sentinels of gossip, and the tea-table groaning under the weight of preserves, meringues, and crustless sandwiches. It was the kind of affair that Alcombe did best: modest, fragrant, and carefully observed. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a sun-dappled sycamore, her knitting needles clicking softly. She was dressed in pale gray, with a sensible hat pinned neatly to her silvery hair. She looked, as always, like someone's forgetful aunt, and not, as some in the village quietly acknowledged, the most terrifying mind within a 5-county radius. "Oh, Miss Marple," fluttered Mrs. Thwaites, the vicar's wife, her voice as sweet as the elderflower cordial in the punch bowl. "I do hope you've tried the lemon drizzle. Mrs. Phelps outdid herself this year." "I'm just about to," said Miss Marple with a smile, though her eyes were not on the cake, but on the young man handing out napkins. He was new. Arthur Bristow, nephew to the recently deceased Mrs. Violet Bristow, who had passed in February after a long illness. He seemed eager, but there was a hesitancy in his manner, a stiffness of speech that did not quite match his claimed upbringing in Surrey. Nearby, Colonel Danforth and Mrs. Elspeth Vine were discussing local council business, though their true object was each other's character, thinly veiled behind complaints about potholes and refuse schedules. Miss Marple caught snatches of the conversation. "It's not the tax I mind, Elspeth, it's what they waste it on. That dreadful mural outside the library, for one." "I quite agree. Ghastly thing. And between you and me, I don't think the painter was sober." The band of school children began their violin piece just as the church bell chimed 4, and then it happened. An interruption so quiet and ordinary that no one truly registered it at first. Mrs. Emmeline Prewitt, widowed for 15 years and fond of hymnals and ancient history, gave a small cry as she returned from the vicarage. "My bag," she murmured faintly. "I left it in the church." Someone offered to fetch it for her, but she refused. "No, I'll go," she insisted, and set off with her usual determination. It wasn't until 20 minutes later that her absence grew conspicuous. "She's not back," said Mrs. Thwaites anxiously. "Do you think something's happened?" The village constable, young and pink-faced, Constable Ridge, was summoned. A few minutes later he returned from the churchyard with an ashen face. "She's in there," he said, "in the front pew, dead." A murmur passed through the garden like wind over water. "It must have been her heart," offered Colonel Danforth, suddenly grave. "She wasn't young." "Or the heat," said Mrs. Vine, fanning herself, though the temperature was barely 22. Miss Marple said nothing, but she gently folded her knitting and placed it in her handbag. By evening, the official word was natural causes. Dr. Hayward, summoned after tea, confirmed a sudden coronary failure. "But," said Miss Marple, looking mildly concerned, "I do wonder." Dr. Hayward looked up from his scrawled notes. "I wonder if anyone noticed the hymn book." "The hymn book?" he asked, frowning. "Yes," she said, tilting her head. "Mrs. Prewitt always brought her own. Black leather cover terribly worn at the edges, with a ribbon marker for her favorite. Number 271, Come Ye Faithful. I happened to see it this morning when I passed her pew after communion. But this afternoon, Constable Ridge said she had no bag. So what happened to it? That was how it began, not with a scream or a visible crime, but with a small discrepancy, a missing hymn book. The next day, Miss Marple visited the church alone. The air was cool and faintly metallic inside, like old stone and older secrets. She walked past the pews until she reached Mrs. Prewitt's usual place. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the faint indent on the velvet cushion and a crumpled service sheet left behind. Then, tucked awkwardly between the pages of the official hymnal, she saw it, a scrap of folded paper. She opened it. The handwriting was faint, hurried, and the message was simple. He isn't who he says he is. If I die suddenly, it wasn't natural. Miss Marple blinked. The tone was unmistakably Emmeline Prewitt's, prim, formal, without a trace of drama. She folded the note back and slipped it into her handbag. As she walked back into the bright daylight of the village green, the sound of lawn mowers and laughter echoed faintly in the distance, but Miss Marple did not smile. Not yet. She had read that kind of note once before, many years ago, during the war, when someone had tried to poison the vicar's curate over a matter involving false identity and stolen silver. People, she often said, are really very much the same, in villages especially. Only the methods change, and so, as Alcombe settled into its gossip and its reassurance that these things just happen to the elderly, Miss Marple began quite quietly to make her inquiries. Chapter 2. Whispers after Vespers. By the time the bell rang for Vespers on Tuesday evening, the village of Alcombe had processed Mrs. Prewitt's death with admirable speed. Sympathy cards had been written. Her rose bush had been clipped by Mrs. Hargreaves so it wouldn't feel neglected. And a casserole rota had been established for her niece Nora, who was due to arrive from Cheltenham by week's end. But beneath the polite condolences and shortbread tins, the village had begun to murmur. She was perfectly healthy, murmured Miss Maud Ellison at the greengrocer's, pausing over a bruised pear. I saw her only yesterday morning, and she looked full of beans. She was never quite the same after Violet Bristow's funeral, confided the postmistress, slipping a letter into her satchel. Told me the village was full of masks. Her words, not mine. And at the hairdresser's, beneath the drone of a dryer. She said someone was watching her, you know. Swore it. These whispers, as such things always do, drifted toward Miss Marple, who accepted them with her usual gentle detachment. But her mind was turning over details, the missing handbag, the cryptic note, and the pointed phrase, "He isn't who he says he is." The question was, who? At Vespers, the pews were sparsely filled, the warm light from the tall stained-glass windows catching the motes of dust that drifted through the air like drowsy fireflies. Miss Marple sat in her usual place, a few rows behind the chancel, her hymn-book open, though she didn't once glance at the words. Arthur Bristow was seated alone near the back, staring fixedly ahead, his posture unnaturally rigid. He looked freshly shaved and slightly out of place in his sharp navy blazer, as if he'd come from the city and hadn't yet shaken it off. His fingers tapped silently on the hymnal spine, betraying nerves no one else appeared to notice. To his right, the Evertons, a retired schoolmaster and his elegant wife, whispered to each other before the organ began its slow, sweet prelude. Across the aisle, young Millie Partridge, Mrs. Prewitt's sometime companion for teas and outings, sat red-eyed, clutching a crumpled handkerchief. Miss Marple noticed every glance, every twitch, every effort not to look at someone too long. After the final hymn, "Abide with Me," the congregation dispersed with solemn nods and the sound of softly shutting hymnals. Miss Marple waited until most had gone before slowly rising and slipping out through the side door into the gravelled path behind the vestry. There, to her mild surprise, she found Arthur Bristow lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. "Mr. Bristow," she said kindly, "I do hope the village hasn't overwhelmed you." He turned quickly, startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it? No, not at all. It's just, I wasn't expecting to inherit an entire house in a place like this. Violet never said much about Alcombe, not to me." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly, "and yet here you are. You've been staying at Bristow House since the will was read, I presume." "Yes. I arrived 3 weeks ago. The solicitor in Bath handled everything. I've started sorting through her effects. The place hasn't changed since I was last there as a boy. Childhood memories can be rather haunting," she said, then added gently, "I believe you knew Mrs. Prewitt." He hesitated. "Not well. Just exchanged pleasantries. She was friendly, but oddly formal, very particular about words. She had a strong sense of right and wrong," Miss Marple replied. "One might say rigid, even." Arthur looked off toward the cemetery wall, where ivy curled up over the stones. "Do you think her death was unusual?" Miss Marple studied him. "That's an interesting choice of word." "Well," he said, exhaling smoke, "I found it unsettling, that's all. She seemed so present, and then gone." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Presence can be deceiving. Some people seem more substantial than they are. Others quite the opposite." He frowned, then dropped the cigarette and crushed it underfoot. "Forgive me. It's been a strange few days." As he walked away, Miss Marple noted the sharp crease in his trousers, the lack of mud on his polished shoes, and the faint but unmistakable scent of cologne. Modern, expensive. She turned and walked back toward the village square. That night, the note burned in her thoughts. He isn't who he says he is. But what had Mrs. Prewitt meant? Was it Bristow himself? Or someone else pretending to be someone they were not? The next morning, Miss Marple paid a call on the vicar. Reverend Lionel Thwaites was a kind man with a distracted air and an unfortunate habit of quoting scripture in wholly inappropriate moments. They took tea in his study, while Mrs. Thwaites rustled in the kitchen. "Reverend," said Miss Marple gently, "do you happen to know whether Mrs. Prewitt kept a key to the vestry?" He blinked. "I believe so, yes. She often arranged the flowers for Sunday." It made things easier. "And did anyone else possess such a key?" He frowned, tapping his teacup absently. "Aside from myself and Mrs. Thwaites. Oh, perhaps Mr. Everton, when he was on the flower committee. Thank you. You've been very helpful." She left with a kind smile, her thoughts moving quickly. Keys. Access. A place where a note could be hidden. A private message left in a public place. Mrs. Prewitt, devout to a fault, would never have scribbled something so ominous unless she had genuinely feared for her life. Yet she had left it in a hymnal, of all places, where someone else might easily have found it, or destroyed it. Unless, of course, that was the intention. Miss Marple spent the afternoon walking the lanes, nodding at passing dog walkers and stopping to inspect roses with a flattering curiosity. But her mind was sifting through human behavior, weighing memory against motive. It was nearly sunset when she reached Bristow House. She did not knock. She simply stood across the lane, gazing at it. A neat, square Georgian home with ivy along the windows, and its curtains drawn too early for summer. A place of stillness, and, she suspected, of careful arrangement. She would return, but not yet. For now, she had another visit to make. One to young Millie Partridge, whose red eyes and trembling hands told Miss Marple something few others would have noticed. Millie had known more than she'd admitted, and in Alcombe, Miss Marple knew from long experience it was not the loudest grief that revealed the most. It was the quietest. Chapter 3. The Tear-Stained Envelope. Miss Marple arrived at the Partridge cottage on the edge of Elmbrook Lane just after tea-time the following day. The ivy-clad home, modest and slightly sagging at the edges, had belonged to the Partridge family for generations. Young Millie lived there now with her widowed mother, who was said to suffer from delicate nerves and had not been seen at church since the New Year. A thin thread of smoke drifted from the chimney despite the summer warmth. Miss Marple knocked gently, and the door was answered by Millie herself, her eyes still faintly puffy. "Oh, Miss Marple," Millie said, her voice thin but polite. "Do come in. Mum's resting upstairs. Thank you, dear. I thought I might call in to check how you were doing. I know you were very close to Mrs. Prewitt." Millie stepped aside, brushing a loose strand of mouse-brown hair behind her ear. She was always kind to me, took me to the church fete, gave me her old gardening gloves, said I reminded her of someone she knew as a girl, Elsie, I think. They settled into the front room, which smelled of chamomile and lavender polish. A ticking mantel clock filled the silences. Millie folded her hands in her lap, her fingers tugging gently at her sleeves. Miss Marple sipped the tea offered. "I expect her death was quite a shock." Millie nodded. I still don't understand it. She didn't seem unwell. She was even fussing about the lilies in the church that morning. Told me the arrangement was too theatrical." Miss Marple gave a gentle chuckle. "That sounds like her. She had a very particular taste in everything, especially people." A flicker crossed Millie's face. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "She confided in you, I think?" Millie bit her lip. "Not exactly. Not in the way you mean. But, well, the week before she died, she was acting strangely. She made me walk her to the post office every day. She kept looking over her shoulder. And one time—" She broke off. "Yes, dear?" prompted Miss Marple softly. "She asked me to post a letter for her, but then she changed her mind and tore it up. I remember because she made such a fuss about the envelope. Said she'd licked it already, and now she couldn't reuse it. She was agitated, not frightened exactly, but tense." "Did you happen to see the name on the envelope?" Millie hesitated, embarrassed. "Just the surname. It said Bristow." Miss Marple gave the faintest nod, as if Millie had simply confirmed the weather forecast. "That's very helpful, Millie. You've done the right thing." Millie looked down. "Do you think it was really her heart?" Miss Marple patted the girl's hand. "Let's just say, I'm not convinced it was only her heart." As she rose to leave, her eyes fell upon a writing desk in the corner. It was cluttered with pens, blotting paper, and a half-used box of envelopes. Something caught her attention, a small tear in the corner of the lid revealing a flash of something inside. A scrap, possibly, tucked between the compartments. But she said nothing. Not yet. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long golden shadows over the hedgerows. Miss Marple made her way to the library on Church Street, a stone building that held not only books, but decades of whispered confessions and unspoken truths passed between shelves. The librarian, Mr. Fenimore, was a precise man with spectacles that magnified his expression into near-constant disapproval. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "back for more Roman novels?" "Not today, thank you. I was hoping you could help me with something quite dull, family records. Parish indexes? Yes, if you have them. Specifically, anything about Violet Bristow and her household in the last 5 years. He led her to a wooden filing cabinet and left her with a faintly suspicious glance. Miss Marple scanned the register with careful fingers. Bristow, Violet, 22nd, February. Left estate to Arthur Bristow, nephew. No mention of other family. Yet Miss Marple distinctly remembered an old conversation with Violet over tea on the church lawn. Violet had spoken of a cousin, Harriet, she'd said, who'd been a disappointment but still corresponded occasionally. No mention of Arthur then. And yet, months later, here was Arthur Bristow, inheriting everything and taking up residence in the house. Miss Marple copied down the probate solicitor's name, Mead and Copplestone, Bath, and tucked it into her bag. That evening, she reviewed everything she knew. Mrs. Prewitt was alarmed enough to write a note implying murder. She had almost posted a letter to Arthur Bristow, then destroyed it. Arthur himself appeared polite, slightly out of place, and evasive. Violet Bristow never once mentioned him in village conversation until her death. Mrs. Prewitt's hymnal, containing the warning, had vanished, replaced or tampered with before being returned. And finally, the bag. The one Mrs. Prewitt said she had left in the church. It was never recovered. Miss Marple stood at her window that night, the village lamplight flickering against the stone walls. A quiet English village, where nothing truly evil should happen. But then again, she mused, evil was rarely loud. It crept, it smiled, it knew when to keep its head down. And she was certain now, someone had been watching Emmeline Prewitt, but more dangerously, someone had made sure she would not speak again. Tomorrow, Miss Marple thought, she would call on Mead and Copplestone, and perhaps, quietly, on Harriet, if Harriet still existed. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Wasn't Mentioned. Miss Marple took the early train to Bath the following morning, the sky an even gray above the fields and hedgerows, and the clouds heavy with unfulfilled rain. She carried a small handbag, a folded scarf in case of drafts, and a worn notepad into which she had copied the solicitor's details from the library the day before. Mead and Copplestone occupied a respectable corner office above a milliner's shop on Stall Street. The brass plaque beside the stair read simply, "Solicitors to Generations." The waiting room was tidy and dull, decorated with ancestral prints, and smelling faintly of floor polish and old wool. A secretary, prim in a cardigan the color of overstewed tea, glanced up from her typewriter. "May I help you?" Miss Marple smiled. "I was hoping to make a brief inquiry regarding the estate of the late Violet Bristow. I am not family, but I have some familiarity with the matter, and wish to ask about a discrepancy in the records, entirely unofficial, of course." The woman's brow creased. "I'm not sure we can provide." "Only a general question," Miss Marple said gently, "about a name that was, or perhaps was not, included in the list of surviving relatives." The secretary hesitated. "One moment, please." 10 minutes later, Miss Marple found herself ushered into a book-lined office where a thin man with spectacles and an impeccable mustache rose from behind a desk. "Miss Marple, Edward Copplestone," he said, shaking her hand. "I understand you had a question regarding the Bristow estate." "Only a small curiosity," she said, settling primly into the chair opposite. "I knew Mrs. Bristow for many years. She often spoke of a cousin, Harriet. I was surprised not to see that name mentioned in the probate notice." Copplestone gave a tight smile. "Ah, yes, Harriet Manners. That was a matter not without complications. The late Mrs. Bristow severed ties with Miss Manners in 1949. There was an estrangement. Financial, I believe. She made a codicil to her will excluding her from any claim. And Arthur Bristow? Miss Marple asked lightly. Ah, yes, the sole beneficiary, nephew through her late husband's side, though somewhat distant. He re-established contact a year before Violet passed. Quite sudden, Miss Marple murmured. Perhaps, said Copplestone, but not unheard of. These reconnections often happen near the end. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. And do you happen to know if Harriet Manners is still living? She is. Last we checked. Painswick, I believe. A nursing home called St. Winifred's. She's in her late 70s now. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. That's most helpful. You've been very kind, Mr. Copplestone. He inclined his head, clearly pleased to have dealt with such a polite and unthreatening presence. Back in the street, the clouds had begun to release a thin drizzle. Miss Marple took shelter beneath a shop awning and jotted the name down in her notebook. St. Winifred's, Painswick. She would not waste time. The train to Stroud left in 40 minutes, and she could take a carriage from there. By early afternoon, she was seated in a sunlit parlor overlooking the lawns of St. Winifred's nursing home. Opposite her, in a high-backed armchair, sat Harriet Manners. Miss Marple had introduced herself plainly, citing her acquaintance with Violet Bristow. Harriet's eyes, pale and watery with age, had not flickered at the name. She never forgave me, Harriet said quietly, though there was nothing to forgive. She was a strong-minded woman, Miss Marple offered. She was a calculating woman, Harriet corrected. She could snip you out of her life like a clipping from a hedge. Harriet's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. Her silver hair was uncombed, her cardigan mismatched with her skirt, but her voice retained the sharp precision of a once formidable speaker. She resented me because Bernard, that was her husband, once said I had finer bone structure than she did. Imagine! One comment over a sherry, and she sulked for 2 decades. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. But I'll tell you what matters, Harriet said, leaning forward. I never believed that Arthur Bristow was who he claimed to be. Oh, he came to see me, you know, just once, about 8 months ago. Told me Violet had invited him back into her life and he was making peace. He asked if I had any old letters from Bernard. Did he? Miss Marple said, concealing her quickened interest. I told him I did not, and I don't, but it was the way he asked. Like he was looking for proof of something. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did he mention where he had been living prior to returning? He said Sussex, but he didn't know the train station near where Violet used to summer. Any real nephew would have known that. And how did he seem to you? Too polished, not a wrinkle in his collar. His eyes never stayed in one place. A mimic, that one. The kind of man who wears another person's smile. Miss Marple folded her hands. And did you tell Violet? Harriet laughed bitterly. She hadn't spoken to me in years, but I did write to Mrs. Prewitt. Miss Marple blinked. To Mrs. Prewitt? Oh, yes. Emmeline and I corresponded. Our mothers were cousins. She was closer to Violet than I ever was. I told her I had my doubts about Arthur and that she ought to watch him. Miss Marple felt a slow knot tighten in her chest. Do you still have the letter you sent? Harriet shook her head. It was posted in January. But Emmeline replied, said she'd keep an eye open, that she had a nose for mischief, as she put it. And did she mention anything suspicious? She said he was charming, but rehearsed. Always correct, but never right, if you understand me. Miss Marple did. She left Harriet with a small bunch of flowers from the St. Winifred's garden and made her way back toward the station. A man who claimed to be a nephew who came asking for proof of identity, who made a favorable impression on a dying woman and inherited everything, and a local lady who had just enough suspicion to notice and paid the price. Back in Alcombe that evening, the wind stirred the trees along the vicarage path. Miss Marple paused by the church gate, her thoughts returning to the hymn book, the torn envelope, and the strange vacancy of Arthur Bristow's past. What Harriet had said rang true, a mimic, the kind of man who wears another person's smile. But mimics, Miss Marple knew, often slipped. The trick was to wait for the moment they forgot who they were pretending to be, and that moment, she suspected, was drawing near. Chapter 5. Beneath the quiet surface, the next morning in Alcombe dawned overcast and strangely hushed, as though the village itself were holding its breath. A light mist clung to the hedgerows, and the church spire vanished intermittently into low clouds. But within Miss Marple's sitting room, the quiet was more calculated. She sat at her breakfast table, a half-eaten scone beside her poring over her notes. A modest pile of clippings, scribbled names, and fragments of conversation sat in careful order before her. Violet Bristow's sudden reconnection with a distant nephew, Mrs. Prewitt's whispered suspicions, the vanished handbag, the torn envelope, Harriet Manners' recollection of a practiced charm and false familiarity. It all pointed to a figure standing on borrowed ground. Arthur Bristow was not who he claimed to be. The question now was not merely identity, but motive and method. Miss Marple folded her notebook and stood. There was someone else she needed to speak with, someone who had likely seen more than she realized. Constable Ridge. The village constable was not a clever man, but he was an earnest one. Miss Marple had always believed that in the absence of brilliance, simple honesty could still be very useful. She found him near the village green, standing awkwardly beside his bicycle, chatting with the baker's apprentice about footpaths and dogs off leads. He turned red the moment he saw her. "Miss Marple, good morning. Was just checking on the perimeter, you know, dog mess complaints and such." "Very commendable," she said gently. "Might I have a moment of your time about Mrs. Prewitt?" Constable Ridge sobered instantly. "Yes, of course. Tragic business. I was hoping you could tell me precisely what you saw when you found her in the pew." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, it was odd. She was just sitting there, very still. I called out, but she didn't answer. No sign of struggle or anything. Her hands were folded, like she'd just stopped. And the bag she said she'd gone to retrieve wasn't there." "You're certain?" "I searched. Under the pew, by the font, in the vestry, too. Nothing. And her hymn book?" He blinked. "Didn't notice one. Thought she might have left it at home." "She never did," said Miss Marple, almost to herself. "And did anyone else enter the church before you went in?" Constable Ridge frowned. "No one that I saw. But then I was over near the green for most of the afternoon." "Quite." She thanked him and moved on, leaving him puzzling in her wake. By early afternoon, she was standing outside Bristow House. The ivy-clad Georgian home sat cool and self-contained behind its rusted iron gate. Miss Marple pressed the bell, and after a moment, Arthur Bristow answered. He looked tired, though impeccably dressed, and his eyes darted past her toward the road before settling on her face. "Miss Marple, this is a surprise." "Do forgive the intrusion," she said with her usual soft manner, but I wondered if you might indulge an old woman with a memory. You see, I remember Violet's parlor so well, her Wedgwood vases, the embroidered footstool. I wondered if they were still in their old places." Arthur hesitated. "Of course. Come in." She stepped into the hallway, which was filled with the faint scent of polish and lilies. The air felt scrubbed of life, like a place trying to remember its own history. The parlor was much as she remembered, orderly, impersonal. "I took the liberty of tidying up," Arthur said. "Some of the old things felt heavy." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, her eyes scanning the room. "Did you find anything of Violet's writing? Diaries, letters?" "Nothing of substance," he said quickly. "A few recipe cards, a birthday list. She didn't write much, I think." "Not in later years," Miss Marple agreed, though she was quite fond of correspondence when her cousin Harriet was still in favor. His expression didn't shift. "So, I've heard." "She mentioned," Miss Marple continued casually, "that you visited her. Harriet, I mean, in Painswick." "Briefly," he said. "Just after the reconciliation with Violet." "What a thoughtful gesture," she said, smiling. "And how did you find her?" Arthur blinked. "Rather bitter, I must say, but we parted civilly." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You know, she seemed quite taken aback to hear you'd inherited everything." He shrugged. "She never got along with Violet. That was known." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, "though it's curious, isn't it, how Violet came to favor you after so many silent years, and then left not so much as a brooch to anyone else." His eyes flicked briefly, a glint of annoyance. "It was her choice. Quite. People often surprise us in their final acts. Sometimes it's just sentiment. Other times it's coercion." Silence fell like a stone between them. Then Arthur's smile returned, brittle at the edges. "Would you like tea?" "No, thank you. I've taken up too much of your time already." She made her way out slowly, aware of his eyes on her until the door shut behind her. But her thoughts were sharper now. His deflections had grown clumsy. A man so polished ought to lie more smoothly. That evening, she visited Millie Partridge again, bearing a tin of almond biscuits. Millie let her in without a word, and they sat once more in the lavender-scented sitting room. "I wanted to ask something peculiar," Miss Marple said, "about the letter Mrs. Prewitt didn't send." Millie nodded nervously. "Do you know what she intended to write?" "No," Millie said. "Only that she wrote and rewrote it twice. She crumpled the first one, then tore up the second. I never read them." Miss Marple looked toward the writing desk. "May I?" Millie nodded. The desk was old, with secret compartments and ink stains beneath the surface. Miss Marple opened the drawers methodically, stationery, stamps, nothing of note, until she felt something catch at the back of the drawer. A thin flap of paper. She drew it out carefully. A torn corner, pale blue, with the faint imprint of a name. Arthur Briss. It was enough. She tucked it away and turned back to Millie. I think she suspected him, and perhaps she found something she wasn't meant to. Millie's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you think he hurt her?" Miss Marple sighed. "I think she made herself dangerous to someone." The next morning brought an unexpected development. Mrs. Elspeth Vine called on Miss Marple just before 10, dressed impeccably in gray and wearing a face of discreet agitation. "I'm not one for eavesdropping," she began. "Of course not," Miss Marple murmured. "But I was at the chemist's yesterday when young Arthur Bristow came in. He didn't see me. He asked for something to help him sleep. The pharmacist offered chamomile tincture, but Arthur pressed for something stronger. When told he'd need a prescription, he asked if anything could be acquired quietly. Miss Marple's eyes did not change, but her heart beat a little faster. And did the pharmacist oblige? No, Mr. Renshaw is very proper, but he was unsettled, I could tell. Thank you, Elspeth. That's most enlightening. When Elspeth had gone, Miss Marple sat back and stared out the window. A man asking for sleep aids without a doctor's note. A man rehearsed in deceit. A man whose victim suspected him enough to leave a hidden message. And that message: if I die suddenly, it wasn't natural. Miss Marple took up her pen and wrote a brief note, which she sent by hand to Inspector Cray at the county station. She did not accuse. She merely asked that Mrs. Prewitt's body, already prepared for burial, be examined more carefully, particularly for traces of anything that might cause a death to look peaceful. A mimic, she thought again. But even the finest impersonators left shadows behind, and Miss Marple, ever so quietly, was following them. Chapter 6. A Disturbance in the Organ Loft. 2 days passed without public development, but Alcombe was never truly still. Beneath the veneer of village calm, children bicycling through puddles, postmen exchanging gossip with shopkeepers, roses blooming dutifully against slate fences, conversations passed in hushed tones. The news that Mrs. Prewitt's burial had been quietly delayed due to a procedural review rippled through the parish with the tactful phrasing that English villages excelled at. Miss Marple, however, remained characteristically calm. She spent her time at the library and the church, rarely asking questions outright, yet listening so keenly that people often found themselves offering more than they meant to. She noticed the way Arthur Bristow kept to himself more each day, appearing only at odd hours, often with a briefcase or satchel that seemed too full for village errands. She also noticed that Mr. Everton, retired headmaster and stickler for punctuality, had begun arriving at church earlier than usual. Much earlier. And so it was that on a drizzly Wednesday morning, Miss Marple decided to attend morning prayers, though it was not her usual custom. The church was nearly empty when she arrived. Reverend Thwaites was arranging his sermon notes in the chancel. Mrs. Thwaites fussed with the floral display, but it was the faint sound above the nave, the low creak of old floorboards overhead, that caught Miss Marple's attention. The organ loft. Few had reason to be there any more. The organ had not been properly tuned in years, ever since the parish switched to the more affordable electronic keyboard installed by a well-meaning committee. But the loft remained unlocked, a relic space that rarely received visitors. Miss Marple waited until the vicar's head was bowed in his missal, then slipped quietly up the narrow side stairs. The organ loft smelled of dust and wax, the kind of smell that never fully left a building once the candles had burned out. Sheet music was piled untidily beside the wooden bench. Cobwebs fluttered faintly in the eaves, but it was the scattered papers on the floor near the far wall that caught her attention. They had not yellowed with age. One sheet bore the corner of a typed letterhead, Mead and Copplestone, Solicitors. Miss Marple bent and gathered them quickly. They were fragments, a torn copy of a letter appointing Arthur Bristow as sole heir, a short typed message in a different font. Arthur, keep the tone mild, and don't draw attention to the change of address. And a partial envelope with a name she did not recognize, J. Whitcomb, Torquay. And among them a small brown bottle with a faded label, Tinctura Papaveris, opium preparation. Miss Marple did not tremble. Instead, she stood very still and listened. Below her, the soft murmur of Reverend Thwaites reached toward the rafters, mingled with bird song from the windows. Who had been hiding documents in the organ loft? Who had carried with them a bottle of laudanum, or something similar, just days before Emmeline Prewitt died quietly in a pew? Miss Marple carefully tucked the papers into her bag, then turned to descend. She made it to the vestibule just in time to avoid crossing paths with Arthur Bristow, who entered from the front with a polite nod to the vicar. He wore a dark overcoat, despite the mild day, and carried the same satchel from earlier that week. Miss Marple stepped to the side and observed him without being seen. He walked straight toward the vestry. No morning prayer. No lingering in a pew. She waited until he emerged 15 minutes later, empty-handed, and strolled back out with the casual gait of a man with nothing to hide. But he had been hiding something. Miss Marple was quite certain of it now. She returned home to review the papers. The letter fragments were troubling. If Arthur had been in contact with someone coaching him on tone and address, who was J. Whitcomb? And what was their connection to the Bristow estate? That evening, as the light waned and the hedgerows grew long shadows, Inspector Cray arrived in Alcombe under quiet orders. Miss Marple greeted him at her front gate. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said. "I don't often get summoned by handwritten notes anymore," Cray replied with a half-smile. "But your letters always imply something worth our time." They sat in her parlor, tea untouched between them, as Miss Marple presented what she had found. Cray read in silence for some time. Tincture of poppy. Not illegal, but restricted. Not sold easily. And potentially fatal in sufficient doses, especially to an elderly woman with mild heart issues. Cray exhaled slowly. "You believe this was administered to Mrs. Prewitt. I believe she was coaxed into her usual pew and given something that slowed her heart just enough to stop it, without signs of struggle. She trusted the person who gave it. Perhaps she thought it was a tonic." Cray tapped the letter. "This envelope, Whitcomb in Torquay, do you recognize it?" "No," said Miss Marple, "but it struck me that someone with legal training might have helped forge identity documents. Perhaps even advised Arthur Bristow how to present himself as Violet's heir. And the Bristow connection to Harriet Manners, that seems to be holding. But only if we believe Arthur Bristow is who he claims to be. Violet had no other nephews, and she never mentioned him to Harriet until last year." Cray considered. "You think he's an impostor?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "he has assumed the name of a man who died long ago." She opened a slim, worn ledger, taken from the church archives. In 1933, Violet's husband Bernard had a nephew named Arthur, but he died in childhood. Scarlet fever. The real Arthur Bristow never reached adolescence. His baptism is recorded here, but there's no record of his adult life because there wasn't one. Cray's brows knit, and yet Violet made out a will in favor of Arthur Bristow, under the assumption that he was the same child she had once known. Cray stood. "I'll issue a request for a search on known aliases. We'll begin with J. Whitcomb. If we can find a connection, we may be able to trace this impostor's real identity." "Be careful," Miss Marple said quietly. "He's meticulous. He's rehearsed, and he knows we're a village of sleepers." That night, a storm broke across the countryside, tearing leaves from the trees and rattling the shutters of cottages across Alcombe. But inside Miss Marple's house, the calm was intact. She lit a single candle in her front room and returned to her knitting, one stitch after another. Precise, predictable. She was no longer waiting for a confession. She was waiting for a mistake, and in her long experience, even the most careful murderers, especially the careful ones, made them in the end. Chapter 7. A Question of Names and Faces. By Thursday morning, the storm had passed, leaving the village washed and strangely brilliant. The cobblestones glistened like polished bone, and the gardens, though bowed with water, stood brighter than before, as if the earth itself had blinked away a secret. But Miss Marple, despite the fine weather, remained troubled. She had sat long into the night, knitting set aside, considering a man who did not exist, or rather, existed only in borrowed memory. Arthur Bristow, a name that belonged to a boy who had died of scarlet fever nearly 5 decades ago. And yet here he was, full-grown, charming, in possession of an estate in a past that did not hold up to the faintest scrutiny. And someone had helped him. That name, J. Whitcomb, gnawed at her. It was common enough not to ring alarms, yet precise enough to be a keystone if placed correctly. She made her decision early and set off toward the train station once again, this time not to travel, but to use the telephone. Though Miss Marple preferred letters for their civility and record, she had learned through necessity that the telephone, while distasteful, had its uses when time was short. She spoke first to Inspector Cray. He had taken the fragment of the Mead and Copplestone letterhead and confirmed with the firm that they had never sent any such communication to Arthur Bristow after the will had been finalized, nor had they retained any legal contact with a Mr. J. Whitcomb. In fact, Copplestone admitted uneasily that the name Whitcomb sounded familiar, but not from our firm. Possibly a clerk from some earlier time. Miss Marple thanked him, and called next a distant cousin, young Julian Marple, a journalist in London whose obsession with public records was only surpassed by his passion for rare cheeses. J. Whitcomb, legal background, Torquay. Can you check if the name has appeared in any civil court or probate filings in the last 5 years? She asked briskly. Julian, to his credit, did not question her odd request. Give me the morning, he said, and I'll ring you back by lunch. Miss Marple returned home and spent the next few hours weeding her garden, methodically snipping rosemary stems and pinching wilted marigolds, her mind grinding over the timeline. Arthur, whoever he truly was, had appeared in Alcombe just after Violet Bristow's death. He had the correct papers, a tidy demeanor, and no one in the village to challenge his identity, except Emmeline Prewitt. And Emmeline had died within days of expressing suspicion. What, then, had she seen? The answer came indirectly, from Milly Partridge. Just before noon, Milly knocked softly on Miss Marple's door, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. I remembered something, she said without preamble. It's odd, but I thought you'd want to know. Come in, dear. Milly sat on the edge of the chair like someone afraid to leave footprints. She twisted a handkerchief in her lap. It was a week before Mrs. Prewitt died. I was over at her cottage, helping her move a box of old hymnals. She was donating them to the mission hall. She opened one and stopped. Inside was a photograph. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. What kind of photograph? 2 boys. One was clearly Violet Bristow's nephew. I'd seen the portrait in her hall years ago. The other, well, I assumed it was a cousin, but Mrs. Prewitt stared at it like she'd seen a ghost. She didn't say much, just muttered, "That's not him. Not the one who came here." Then she put the picture in her bag and asked me to help with the tea. Do you know what became of it? Milly shook her head. She said she'd put it in her drawer for safekeeping, but I never saw it again. Miss Marple sat very still. A photograph, a proof. the kind of irrefutable visual evidence that couldn't be explained away by paperwork or charm. If Emmeline had retained that photograph, and Arthur had discovered it. She thanked Milly, walked her to the door, and stood for a long moment beneath the eaves. Somewhere that photograph still existed, or had been destroyed. Either way, it had changed everything. At 1:30, the telephone rang. "Julian?" she asked. "You're right to be curious," came her cousin's enthusiastic voice. "J. Whitcomb isn't a solicitor. He was disbarred 4 years ago for falsifying inheritance paperwork. Last known address was a boarding house in Torquay. But he dropped off the radar 18 months ago. No new licenses, no practice filings. But get this, his last known client, a man named Alan Morse." Miss Marple's breath caught, and Morse tried to assume the identity of a deceased cousin to gain access to an inheritance in Somerset. Was nearly successful, too, until an observant nurse noticed inconsistencies in his family stories. No criminal conviction. There wasn't enough proof. But he vanished after that. No records since. Nothing official. Alan Morse. A name with no current home. No trace. Unless he now called himself Arthur Bristow. Miss Marple wrote the name on a fresh card and underlined it once, slowly. That evening, just after supper, she made her way, deliberately, gently, to Bristow House. Arthur answered the door with the same courteous smile, but there was something strained in the corners now, as if the mask had been held too long and the seams had begun to fray. "Miss Marple." "Another visit? I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." He stepped aside. "I've been thinking about Emmeline Prewitt," she said, her tone mild as she sat on the edge of the armchair. She always said there was something false about good manners that arrived too suddenly. Arthur smiled faintly. She was a sharp woman. Sharp enough to know a real nephew from a forged one. The pause that followed was brief, almost imperceptible. But Miss Marple had spent her life watching the moments between speech. "I'm not sure I take your meaning," he said. She met his gaze. "I think your name isn't Arthur Bristow. I think your real name is Alan Morse. And I think you've done this before." He didn't speak, not immediately. She rose slowly. "You know what gave you away?" His mouth opened, but no words emerged. "You didn't remember the photograph, the one in Violet's hallway. You only remembered the name. And you coached yourself with old letters, perhaps given to you by your friend Whitcomb, before he disappeared. But Violet was ill. She wanted to believe someone cared, and she was too proud to ask questions." His hand curled at his side. "I suspect," she continued, "that Emmeline Prewitt confronted you, or worse, told you she'd written to the solicitor in Bath. You couldn't let her. You slipped something into her tea that afternoon, something that wouldn't be detected unless someone knew to look." He took a step toward her, too quickly. Miss Marple didn't flinch. "Inspector Cray is waiting down the road." That halted him. "I asked him to remain out of sight until I left your house, because I knew, you see, that you couldn't quite keep your story together now that someone else knew it." The door opened. Inspector Cray stepped inside with 2 constables behind him. Arthur Bristow, Alan Morse, stood frozen, his face unreadable. Cray spoke calmly. "Mr. Morse, you're under arrest on suspicion of identity fraud and conspiracy to defraud the Bristow estate. We also have reason to believe you may be connected to the death of Mrs. Emmeline Prewitt." The silence that followed was long. Then Arthur exhaled. "She shouldn't have interfered," he said at last. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. not in triumph, but in sorrow. Somewhere in the depths of human behavior, even the cleverest lies were built on arrogance, and Emmeline Prewitt had seen through the smile. As the constables led him away, Miss Marple remained behind for a moment in the hallway. There, on a sideboard, was a half-burned photograph. She lifted it gently. 2 boys, one recognizably Violet's real nephew, the other, Alan Morse. She tucked the photograph into her handbag. Justice, after all, was never quite enough. Not in a village. But the truth had a way of echoing, quietly, persistently, beneath the hymns and hedgerows, and Miss Marple, once again, had heard it first. Chapter 8. The Choir That Sang Too Loud. Arthur Bristow, Alan Morse, was gone from Alcombe by dusk. The constables had taken him quietly, with little ceremony, down to the county station. No sirens, no raised voices. The village scarcely noticed until the following morning, when Mrs. Thwaites mentioned at the butcher's that someone from Bristow House had been driven off in a rather official-looking motor car. By midday, everyone knew. Speculation bloomed like late hydrangeas. Was he a jewel thief? A spy? A cousin disinherited and driven mad? No one could agree, but no one was short on ideas. And yet Miss Marple said nothing, not because she wished to hoard the truth, but because the truth, still forming its final shape, was not yet ready to be told. She had learned long ago that murders, like fungi, thrived best in the dark. And though the light had now been let in, there remained damp places beneath the surface. That evening, as she returned from her walk past the church, she found Millie Partridge waiting on her garden bench. The girl stood quickly. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to bother you, but—" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not at all. Come inside." They sat at the little round table by the window. Millie held her teacup with both hands, like someone cold despite the warmth of the room. "I just had to ask," she began. "Now that he's gone, Mr. Morse, I mean, does that mean it's finished?" Miss Marple stirred her tea once. "Not quite. You see, dear, impersonating a dead nephew is only part of it. The crime is not only in the fraud, it's in the method, and in the silence afterward." Millie frowned. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple continued, "about the photograph you saw in Mrs. Prewitt's hymnal, and the photograph I found nearly burned on Arthur's sideboard. They were not the same copy. He must have destroyed hers, or thought he had, and replaced it with a doctored image. But Mrs. Prewitt, clever woman that she was, likely hid the original." Millie set her cup down. "You think it still exists?" "I do," said Miss Marple, "and I believe she hid it somewhere no one would think to look, somewhere she still considered sacred." Millie's eyes widened. "The church." "Precisely." Miss Marple rose and fetched her shawl. "Would you be so kind, dear, as to walk with me?" The church was empty when they arrived, the evening light casting fractured colors through the stained glass windows. Dust floated in the golden beams. The scent of lilies, freshly arranged for Sunday, hung sweet and slightly funereal. Miss Marple led Millie to the front pew. "She sat here," she said softly, "the day she died, and said she left her bag." Millie nodded. "But it was never found, because it wasn't meant to be." Miss Marple knelt slowly, age catching at her knees, and reached beneath the pew. Her fingers traced the wooden underside until they found a narrow slit between panels. She felt something there, flat, thin, carefully tucked. She withdrew it gently. A cloth envelope, faded but dry, pressed so tightly it had avoided even the spring rains. Inside were 2 items: the photograph, unchanged, showing the real Arthur Bristow beside his mother, unmistakably the child from Violet's house portrait, and a letter, penned in Emmeline Prewitt's distinctive hand. If this is found after my death, know this: the man calling himself Arthur Bristow is not the boy Violet once knew. I remember him from 1933. He had a crooked tooth and a scar on his chin from falling near the chapel steps. The man now in her home has neither. He is a stranger, polished, persuasive, but false. I pray someone will see through him. If I am gone, know that I tried. Miss Marple held it quietly. Milly whispered, she knew. She really knew. She always did, said Miss Marple, but she couldn't prove it without help. And now, with this, we can be certain. I'll give it to Inspector Cray. It may not alter the charges, but it closes the circle. They stood for a moment in silence. Then Miss Marple looked toward the choir loft, her eyes narrowing. Milly, did you ever notice anything unusual up there? Recently. The girl looked up. Only the singing. Last Sunday's choir practice was louder than usual. I remember Reverend Thwaites looked annoyed, said it shook the nave. Miss Marple gave a small nod and made her way to the side stairs. The choir loft was dim, its long bench scuffed from decades of shifting hymnals and teenage feet. The old organ still sat like a skeleton in the center. Miss Marple approached slowly. Behind it, tucked in the space between the pipes and the wall, lay a small black valise. She opened it. Inside, a stack of letters, tied in string, documents bearing Violet Bristow's old address, and, most damning of all, a forged birth certificate in the name of Arthur Bristow, created in 1958, and signed in a hand that clearly didn't match any civil registry. So that was the plan, she thought. Not just to impersonate, but to bury the real past beneath enough counterfeit truth to make the lie feel inevitable. Miss Marple took the case and returned downstairs. Milly, she said, would you do me one last kindness? Anything. Take this to Inspector Cray. He'll be at the vicarage by now. Tell him I've found the rest. Milly nodded and hurried off with the case in hand, her steps echoing in the evening hush. Miss Marple remained, gazing up at the stained glass window above the altar. St. Michael vanquishing the dragon. It had always amused her, that image. It was too theatrical, too sharp for the quiet world of Oldcombe. The real vanquishings, she thought, were done with thread and needle, a glance over tea, a forgotten hymn. No sword needed. The next morning, the village awoke to something close to peace. Inspector Cray confirmed that the documents in the valise, combined with Emmeline Prewitt's letter and the forged inheritance filings, would ensure Alan Morse remained behind bars for a very long time. No poison charge, perhaps, not yet. But fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice would suffice. At the market, people resumed their usual quarrels about marmalade quality and hedge encroachment. Mrs. Hargreaves pronounced the Roses deeply unsettled by all this tension, and young Timmy Crouch resumed bouncing his ball against the vicarage wall, to the vicar's thinly veiled despair. And Miss Marple? She returned to her garden. The weeds, after all, had grown quite bold in her absence. That afternoon, as she dead-headed the zinnias, Mrs. Vine appeared at her gate, holding a small box. Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Elspeth. I had these lemon shortbreads and I thought of you. How kind. Mrs. Vine lingered. Do you ever tire of it? The solving? Miss Marple smiled gently. Not of the truth, only of the need for it. Mrs. Vine nodded, then added a little too casually, and how did you know? About him, I mean. Miss Marple brushed soil from her gloves. "He was too careful," she said simply. "Real family doesn't rehearse their memories. They muddle them. But Arthur Bristow never forgot a single detail. That, Elspeth, is not natural." Mrs. Vine blinked. "So, he made the mistake of being too correct." "Precisely. People lie in disorder. Truth, I'm afraid, is rarely that tidy." They took tea together beneath the rose arbor, the mystery fading behind them like mist before the sun. But Miss Marple, ever quietly watchful, still listened to the world around her. Because even in a village as small and lovely as Alcombe, where the choir sang and the vicar scolded children for muddy knees, there were always more secrets under the silence. Chapter 9. The Shadow Behind the Curtain. Though the case of Arthur Bristow, Alan Morse, more accurately, had largely been laid to rest, the village of Alcombe remained subtly changed. There was no grand announcement, no public confession shouted from the green, but in the stillness between shop bell chimes and hymn verses, a kind of tremor persisted. Miss Marple felt it not in words, but in silences, those longer pauses before a neighbor responded, the strange hush that accompanied Mrs. Thwaites' cheerful remarks, the way even Constable Ridge looked a little paler when passing Bristow House. It was the sort of unease that clings to a place when something deeper than crime has occurred, when trust itself has shifted just slightly out of place. Miss Marple had known that feeling before. She often said that in small villages, murders didn't tear the world apart as much as they ever so gently nudged the curtains of everyday life, revealing a shadow people had long suspected, but never quite dared to name. And yet, though the case seemed settled, she was not at ease. There were things that hadn't fit. Emmeline Prewitt's death had been clever, subtle enough to go undetected, if not for a note, a missing bag, and a growing weight of observation. But something about the timing still bothered her. The photograph had been hidden, the documents stashed in the organ loft, yes. But Emmeline hadn't been the only person suspicious of Arthur's claims. Harriet Manners had also seen through him, and she was still alive. So why hadn't he silenced her too? Miss Marple spent the next day reviewing the timeline again, walking through the sequence in her mind as she strolled along Elmbrook Lane, waving politely at Mrs. Finch's dog and nodding at young Timothy Crouch, who was now practicing cartwheels beside the postbox. The letters from Emmeline, the photo, the false documents, the visit to Harriet, and then, all of a sudden, a surge of activity. Violet Bristow's funeral, the will, Arthur's move into the estate. It had all been quite well timed. Too well. She paused beneath the lich gate at the church and stared up at the stone. What had Violet been told before she died? And who had truly prompted her to alter her will? That evening, she wrote another note to Inspector Cray. "Dear Inspector, I hesitate to press upon your time further, but I find I must. I believe there is still a thread left dangling, one that was perhaps overlooked in the larger fabric. Might I request a closer look at Violet Bristow's original will and the codicil that followed, and, if available, a comparison of her signature across the two? Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." She had scarcely posted it when a knock came at the door. It was Reverend Thwaites. He looked as though he had aged a little overnight, his collar slightly askew, and his eyes ringed with fatigue. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "might I speak to you about something rather delicate?" "Of course," she said at once. "Please do come in." He sat at the edge of her armchair like a man confessing to a bishop, hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I received a letter this morning," he said, from a Miss Harriet Manners. I believe you're acquainted." "Indeed." "She claims she sent a letter directly to me some months ago, expressing concerns about the man calling himself Arthur Bristow. But I never received it." Miss Marple sat forward. "And yet you have now?" "It was redirected," said the vicar, "found in the back of the church mail cupboard. The envelope was still sealed, but the date was March, 3 months ago. And in her letter, she mentioned her suspicions. Quite plainly, she noted inconsistencies in Arthur's stories, his failure to remember childhood details, even his aversion to being photographed. She urged me to contact Mead and Copplestone to verify his identity, or at least question Violet about the will." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. "But it never reached you, and Violet changed her will shortly after." The vicar nodded grimly. "It seems someone intercepted it, and left it hidden. Perhaps with the intention of destroying it, but hesitating at the last moment." Thwaites hesitated. "I must admit, Miss Marple, I feel as though I've failed." She reached over and patted his hand. "Not at all. You cannot be blamed for another's deception, but we can still follow its trail." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat in her parlor well into the evening. A forgery, a manipulated will, a forged identity. It was no longer just a case of impersonation. It was a conspiracy, and likely Violet Bristow had been a target long before her death. Inspector Cray returned her note with haste. "Miss Marple, your instincts serve us well again." The signature on the codicil differs slightly from Violet Bristow's previous records, not enough to alarm an untrained eye, but the loops in her B and the slope of her V are noticeably different. Our handwriting expert suspects imitation. Furthermore, the date on the codicil is just 2 days after Violet's last known visit to the doctor, during which she reported confusion and fatigue. There is now cause to believe she may have been drugged. Thank you, as always." Cray, Miss Marple, leaned back in her chair, fingers pressed together. So it had been murder, after all. Not only Emmeline, but Violet, too. Not with force or knife, but with subtle pressure, poison of a different sort. Enough to disorient, enough to convince. And then, when the will was altered, enough to leave no trace. It explained why Harriet had been left alive. Violet had been the true barrier. She rose, paced slowly across the room, and paused by her bookshelf. The murderer, Alan Morse, had not worked alone. She was certain of it now. There had been too many polished steps, too many helpful misdirections, the forged documents, the forged will, the legal phrasing, J. Whitcomb. But if Whitcomb had not been seen for over a year, who else had stepped in? She needed to know who had helped Violet draft that final codicil. She called Mead and Copplestone again the next morning. "I'm terribly sorry to trouble you again," she said sweetly to the secretary, "but could you tell me who delivered the revised codicil to your office? Was it mailed, or brought in person?" The secretary, flustered, rummaged through files. "It was hand-delivered," she said at last, "by, let me see, a Mr. Daniel Everly." "Everly?" said Miss Marple sharply. "Yes. Said he was acting as a family friend. Left a calling card with a Bath address." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Daniel Everly had been a solicitor once, a junior clerk in Somerset before his name had turned up in connection to a minor inheritance dispute. She had read about it years ago in the back pages of the Telegraph. His license was never revoked, but he quietly disappeared from legal practice after 2018. And the Evertons, Mr. and Mrs., had lived quietly in Alcombe for almost 3 years. Mr. Everton, retired schoolmaster, with suspiciously elegant penmanship and a knowledge of legal phrasing. She remembered the moment now, weeks earlier, when he had been one of the few with a key to the vestry. He had access. She did not wait. Within the hour, she had sent a sealed note to Inspector Cray. There's a second conspirator, possibly the originator. Name: Daniel Everly, living as Mr. Geoffrey Everton. Former legal clerk, forgery likely within his skill. I believe he not only assisted Alan Morse, but introduced him to the Bristow estate. Recommend immediate investigation. Jane Marple. And then she waited, calmly, serenely, knitting once more beneath her window, though the needles moved with more purpose than usual. It had taken 2 people to undo Violet's life. Now it would take one more step to tie them both to the truth. Chapter 10. The Note Scribbled in the Hymnal. It was a Sunday, like any other, or so it seemed. The bell in Alcombe's church tower rang out over hedges and rooftops, calling the villagers to worship. Children filed in with damp collars and polished shoes. Mr. Everton, quiet, punctual, always slightly stooped, stood beside his wife in their usual pew. Mrs. Thwaites placed a hand on her husband's shoulder as the organ began its slow, sonorous prelude. But even as the choir launched into "O Worship the King," something moved beneath the stillness. The vicar's gaze, usually soft and diffused, now held a kind of watchfulness. And Miss Marple, seated discreetly 4 rows back, did not look at her hymnal once. She was watching the Evertons. The service ended without disturbance. People murmured greetings, adjusted hats, and filed out into the cool summer air. And then, just as Mr. Everton reached the lich gate, Inspector Cray stepped forward. "Mr. Everton," he said calmly, "might I have a word?" The older man turned, blinking mildly. "Certainly, Inspector. If this is about the path paving, it's about Violet Bristow," Cray said gently, "and the will you helped her write." Miss Marple saw it then, a flicker, not fear, but a faint, calculating stillness, like a man reaching for a bluff. "I merely offered to deliver the documents. She was elderly, unwell." "That's not how Miss Marple remembers it," Cray replied. Everton's eyes met hers, and Miss Marple, never unkind but never unsure, stepped forward. "You knew Alan Morse," she said softly. "I believe you met him in Somerset, perhaps in connection with one of your earlier clients. You recognized a useful tool in him, someone to impersonate the Bristow heir." Everton said nothing. "You coached him, gave him letters from Violet's past, copied from her correspondence. You helped forge the birth certificate, and you prepared the codicil to the will. You even rehearsed the phrasing. You told him to charm her, wear the past like a borrowed coat." Still silence. But Emmeline Pruitt noticed. Harriet Manners noticed. Violet herself began to grow suspicious. So you altered her medications, subtly, gently, until she was just muddled enough to sign what you placed before her. Mrs. Everton, pale now, had stopped breathing. Her hand trembled as it clutched her handbag. "You didn't mean to murder her," Miss Marple went on, "but it was murder, nonetheless. A soft one. The kind committed with suggestion and ink instead of blade or poison." Cray produced a paper. "We found the original will in your attic, alongside rough drafts of the forgery." Everton closed his eyes, and that was it. No fight, no denials. Just a slow, resigned breath, as though he'd always known this moment would come, eventually. He was escorted away, his wife trailing behind him like a pooper kite in windless air. Alcombe watched, stunned, as the couple disappeared down the lane in the inspector's car. By late afternoon, the story had made its way through every teacup and every sitting room. The facts were known. Arthur Bristow had been an invention, Alan Morse a fraud, Emmeline Pruitt a quiet sentinel, and Geoffrey Everton, formerly Daniel Everley, had been the mind behind the curtain. But Miss Marple, despite the village's attempts to celebrate her triumph, was subdued. She sat alone in the vestry that evening, staring down at a hymnal resting on the table. The very one in which Emmeline Pruitt had left her note. It had been replaced and reshelved after the case closed, as if to return the church to its former innocence. But Miss Marple knew better. The note had said, "He isn't who he says he is. If I die suddenly, it wasn't natural." A message not shouted, not broadcast, just quietly tucked between hymnals, waiting for someone who knew how to read the space between words. She closed the book gently. Outside, the evening bells rang again. The village was calm now. Bristow House had been sealed, its windows shuttered. The roses in Mrs. Finch's garden bloomed with stubborn cheer. And yet, something had shifted in Alcombe. Not broken, but peeled back. The truth had been there all along, in the missing bag, in a forged will, in a note scribbled in the hymnal. Miss Marple stepped out into the gathering dusk, and the world, as ever, looked ordinary. Quiet, harmless. She knew better.